So last week we talked about the historical background leading up to the book of Daniel. So just the really 30-second quick rundown of that is it's important to remember the empires that came in succession with one another. You have the Babylonian Empire, the Persian Empire, and then the Greek Empire. We talked about those three. And the crazy things that Alexander the Great did was spreading the Greek Empire, and then how after Alexander's death, the empire split basically into four parts. And the two parts that are the most consequential to the Jews in Jerusalem were the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, the Ptolemaic kingdom and the Seleucid kingdom. The Ptolemies basically ruled over Egypt, and they also had the area where Jerusalem is in the Palestine area right there. And the Seleucids were everything north and to the east of that. And for about a century, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies warred with one another. A lot of that happened in Jerusalem's backyard, and so they were greatly affected by all. Eventually, in 198 BC, the Seleucids won back or took from the Ptolemies the area surrounding Jerusalem, the area of Judea. So then the Jews went from being under Ptolemaic control to be under Seleucid control. And at first, it kind of started okay for them, but things got rougher, especially when a man named Antiochus IV came to power. And things got really bad under Antiochus. For starters, he inherited a very unstable kingdom, and he owed a lot of money to Rome. So this man would essentially stop at nothing to be able to pay Rome off, because if he couldn't pay Rome off, Rome would basically come in and take over his kingdom. So he would begin going around, pillaging temples that are around the area, taking money from these people groups and from their temples and all that. He would do this to Jerusalem. He was also very much so forcing civilization, the Greek way of living, the Greek culture, the Greek language. He was force feeding it down his subjects' throats. And the Jews, very much so, a lot of them, not all of them, some bought into that, became what were known as Hellenistic Jews. And we still read about them in the time of the New Testament. They're still there. That divide still exists in the time of Jesus and the time of the book of Acts. So many of them embraced Hellenism, the Greek way of life and the Greek language, and many did not. So there was a schism forming within the Jewish people themselves, and they had to deal with all this stuff coming from Antiochus. And all of it hit a boiling point in 167 BC, where basically Antiochus had had enough, and he came in, destroyed Jerusalem, desecrated the temple, set up an altar to Zeus and in the temple, basically outlawed practicing Jewish religion in all forms, outlawing the Sabbath and outlawing all these things, their festivals and everything. If you did any of that, you'd be killed forever. So obviously things got really bad under them. They were heavily persecuted. It's one of the worst periods of persecution in Jewish history. And that's saying a lot, so that's saying an absolute lot. So they were really going through it at that. So the book of Daniel we introduced last week really addresses the readers at that time and in that situation and what they're going through. And so we're going to see as we go through the book here, as we go through these visions, how it very heavily hits that specific time period and the message that it delivers to the Jews during that time. Okay, so to begin doing that, as we're getting ready now to finally actually approach the book of Daniel, we didn't get to do that at all really last week. The first thing I'd like to do is take a look at the structure of the book, just kind of see from a 1,000-foot view kind of how it's laid out. So the most obvious thing, and we talked about this last week, is that we kind of feel like there's two halves to the book. Okay, the first six chapters are full of these stories or narratives or tales, including stories such as Daniel and his friends refusing to eat the king's food, or the fiery furnace, or Daniel and the lion's den. These kind of things, the things that we've heard about from Sunday school, Sunday school. And it's a pretty easy read, and you're like, okay, this is cool. Then you get to chapter 7, and you're like, what happened to my book? This was enjoyable to read. And all of a sudden, starting in chapter 7, you have these crazy dreams full of these wacky images and these insane interpretations. And it's all of a sudden it's talking about these beasts and goats and rams and all this kind of like what's going on, what's happening with all of this. And so, just in a very quick cursory reading of the book, you can see this seismic shift that happens between chapter 6 and chapter 7. So, it would be really easy to say, just looking at that and saying, okay, we can just break the book up into two parts. But here's where it gets really interesting. Um, the other thing is, aside from just the stark difference in how everything's presented, I have just a couple of other things listed here I want to point out. You'll even see the themes of the two parts of the book change. So, in those stories or in those tales, one of the main themes that you see is trying to answer the question how to remain faithful in an unfaithful land. Okay, so it's representative of the time of the Babylonian exile, and these people have been taken out of Jerusalem. They can no longer worship God the way they're supposed to be able to, right? They're forced to live in this land and forced to do things like eat food that they don't want to eat or bow down to idols that they don't want to bow down to. And so, how do you remain faithful in the midst of that? And that really would be a very pressing question to people that are in exile, right? Or even people that are under Hellenistic being forced to learn a different way of life, right? It kind of applies across all of those things. And I think that's a message that also applies very well to us today, right? We walk through our world and on our average interaction with our world on a day-to-day basis, it's not usually a godly one, right? And our world and our society is not one that's usually pulling us toward Christ, but rather pushing us away. So we ask those same questions today. How do I remain faithful in an unfaithful land? So they're really relevant questions for all time. They really are. Um, what we see also in those stories is that God rewards people who remain faithful. You see it over and over again in his tales, right? Daniel's asked to do something bad, refuses, and is being rewarded for it, right? In some way, shape, or form. And after being fed to lions, that kind of thing. But God still honors that, and he gets rewarded for it. This is where it gets interesting, though, is during those tales there's really no articulated desire for exile to end, but rather the question is, how do I prosper in it? You may notice that in those tales, right? The question's never hanging, how do we return back to Jerusalem? How can we put an end to this? It's simply, how do we prosper in the situation we're in? And kind of partnered with that is that you have the Gentile kings that are in these stories, whether it be Nebuchadnezzar or Darius, for example, in the lion's den story. You see that these kings sometimes acknowledge God for themselves and they can be redeemed, right? So you see the Gentile kings themselves have kind of this redemptive part to them. Like they have it within them to acknowledge God and to be redeemed, right? To have this redeeming quality. These things all change when you get to Daniel. I think I had 1 through 7 there. Let's say 7 through 12. So there's our first typo of the day. So Daniel 7 through 12, you see these things all change. First of all, the main push of these chapters are God will punish the wicked and establish an eternal kingdom. Right. So the question is no longer how do you remain faithful in a faithful land, but it's God, when are you going to show up and put an end to this? Right? When are you going to show up and just destroy the wicked? Right? And that's the main teaching through that. The message to the faithful, right, is not if you're faithful, you will prosper. It's you are being terrorized, but you need to keep the faith. All right. So you see even a shift there. You're being killed, you're being terrorized, but it will end. All right. Big shift in emphasis right there. There's an overwhelming desire for God to move and end their situation. Like I said in those tales, you really don't have a hint of that. It's, the desire is God, can you prosper us? But the desire in the latter half is God, you need to move, put an end to this situation right now. It's a very different thing there. And the final thing, which is really big, is the Gentile kings or kingdoms in these visions are completely irredeemable. Right? There's no mention of any of them ever acknowledging God or any attempt to try to reach them. It's just they need to be destroyed. It all needs to come to an end. So just the fact that yes, go ahead.
I said, was there a change in attitude?
He asked if there was a change in attitude. And yes, absolutely. That's actually what I'm getting right to. So, yep, good question. It's right where I'm going. So, not only do you see a big change in just how the books are presented, the literature, if you will, tales versus this apocalyptic type literature. But you do see a change in attitude. And probably what that's meaning then is that there's a change in the time in which the first half and the second half of the book of Daniel is written. It is very likely, and most people believe, that the first half of the book of Daniel was probably still written in the Hellenistic period, but probably before the reign of Antiochus IV. It was written more during a time where things were a little more peaceful, where Judah was, essentially able to kind of rule themselves. They weren't being heavily persecuted. And in that respect, you can see that those questions of how do we remain faithful in spite of things being difficult is important. But then Antiochus comes in and he's killing Jews left and right. He's outlawing the Sabbath. He desecrates the temple, and there's just war going on, right? You can see the shift. The shift in attitude that happens at that point is this needs to end, right? This needs to be over with. And what Antiochus the Fourth is doing, there's no redemption for that. Like this man is irredeemable, he just needs to be destroyed. And you can feel the desire coming from the people in that. So yeah, there is a shift in attitude. And it appears that it's probably because of a shift in the time in which it's written and all that kind of stuff. So all of that to say, it seems like you can pretty nicely, pretty evenly divide the book of Daniel into part one and part two, right? Part one, written a little earlier, different dealing with different types of literature, different themes. Part two, written later, again, different type of literature, different themes. And that seems all nice, cut and dry, right? Well, there's always a complication, right? Here's one of the weird things. The language that the book of Daniel is written in is actually different, okay? So about half of the book of Daniel is written in Aramaic and half is written in Hebrew. So you've probably heard it said that the Old Testament is written in Hebrew. And that is about 99.8% true, or I don't know the exact percentage. But there's actually a few chapters in the book of Daniel that's written in Aramaic. And there's a little bit in the book of Ezra that's written, like a chapter about that's written in Aramaic. And I feel like there's like one line is in the book of Jeremiah or something that's written in Aramaic. So there's like one other spot where you come across it. So yeah, there's very little bit of Aramaic in here. Okay, quick little talk about what Aramaic is. Aramaic is a very similar language to Hebrew. If you know Hebrew, you can probably fluently understand about 70 to 75% of Hebrew. If you know Hebrew, you know about 70% of Aramaic. I think that's what I'm trying to say. It would probably be similar. I don't know if anyone's ever traveled to a country that speaks English, but it's a really, really, really different dialect. I don't mean like going to England or Australia, maybe a couple weird words here and there. They're different. I mean, for example, I went to Liberia, Dr. Titus, and he was born in Liberia. And while I was there for a couple of weeks, interacting with the Liberian people, they spoke English, but it was really hard to have a conversation with them. Like the dialect was so different. It wasn't just the accent. It was some of the words that were used, the way things were said. And so there was a guy named Laban over there I got to be really good friends with, and I really enjoyed interacting with him. But it was hard having a conversation with this guy. Like he had to repeat himself a lot. Of course, he understood everything I was saying because they watch a lot of American TV. So like I was at a disadvantage. He could understand me, but I couldn't understand him. So like he was speaking English. It was just off enough from what I was used to that it was really difficult. So that's probably something like Hebrew and Aramaic is they're very similar. It's almost the same language, but it's just different enough that there's a different vocabulary and things are enunciated a bit differently. So that's kind of the difference between them. Aramaic was the language of the Persian Empire. All right, so the Persians came just before the Greeks. So when the Persians were taking over, Aramaic was spreading, and that became the popular language of commerce. And as you know from what I talked about last week, when Alexander the Great came in and everything after that, the Greek language began to take over. So with Daniel, the first part of Daniel being written a little bit earlier, it seems to have had come from in Aramaic. It's in Aramaic written down because that was the predominant language of the time. And when we get to the New Testament, just the normal language that Jesus and his disciples would have been speaking in is probably Aramaic, right? They would have known Hebrew for sure, but that was just kind of the common language in Jerusalem at that time for the most part. But here's the weird part about how the language breaks down. So chapter 1 is in Hebrew. Chapter 2, minus just a couple verses, 2 through 7 is in Aramaic, and then 8 through 12 is in Hebrew again. And you were like, no, wait a minute. And it would make sense if I was standing here telling you 1 through 6 is one language and 7 through 12 is the other language. You can tie it up with a nice bow, right? So what's going on here? Because when you get to chapter 7, that's that first of that really weird visions. Why is that still in Aramaic? Why does that feel like that goes with the first part as far as the language is concerned? But it feels like in content that it goes with the second half where the rest of it's all written in Hebrew. And why on earth is chapter 1 written in Hebrew? Right? Like where did that come from? Okay, flip to the next page with me. So to be sure, there's not one explanation for that every commentator agrees on, that every expert agrees on. There's a lot of discussion surrounding this. The most commonly held belief, and the one that does make the most sense to me, honestly, it probably looks something like this. Chapters 2 through 6 were tales that were written in Aramaic. Okay, these are the stories about Nebuchadnezzar's dream, the fiery furnace, Nebuchadnezzar turning into a beast, the writing on the wall, and Daniel the lion's den. Okay, so chapters 2 through 6. So these are probably stories about Daniel and his friend that had circulated since the time of the Babylonian Empire, right? Or the Babylonian exile. They had been handed down orally, they've been circulating, they've been told, and at some point, someone wrote them down in Aramaic, right? That's probably what's going on with that right there. So then, at some point at a later date, when the rest of Daniel was written in this 165 BC time period around Antiochus IV, the person that wrote those visions was seeking to. I talked about this last week about how apocalyptic literature works and writing synonymously in the name of someone else was wanting to attach to that Daniel tradition to tell the stories through that vehicle, if you will. And so, probably what was going on, what happened here is chapters 7 through 12 were written in these visions, but chapter 7 was written in Aramaic, and I'm not good. I know biblical Hebrew pretty well. I'm good enough to pick up on this kind of stuff. But experts have realized that the language of chapter 7, even though it's written in Aramaic, the same language as chapters 2 through 6, it seems to be obvious that it's written by a different person. The quality level of the Aramaic is not as high as the earlier poets. So the person that wrote this is more comfortable writing in Hebrew than in Aramaic. But like I said, they're so similar that they know how to write in Aramaic. So chapter 7 is written in such a way that the content connects back to chapter 2. We're going to talk about that. So the content and the language kind of connect back to those tales a little bit, but they also connect forward to the rest of the crazy dreams and visions. So it seems like this was probably intentionally done by this author to unify the book, to bring it together. Chapter 7 was written in such a way, the language it was written to bring it all together and have connections going both ways. And it forms a cool chiasm that I'll talk about here in just a second as well. So then you may say, okay, well, that sounds cool. Well, why is chapter 1 in Hebrew? What's going on there? It's probably this one's a bigger question mark, and there's even bigger arguments about this. But the one, again, that makes the most sense to me is probably this same author possibly wrote chapter 1 or put it down in writing, not saying it wasn't already a story that had been told, but wrote it down as an introduction to the book, wrote it in Hebrew, and it's something that kind of unifies the whole book. It brings an introduction that maybe wasn't there before, and it just kind of ties it all together with a nice introduction to begin. So it seems like that's probably how the book came together over time, and what accounts for the different styles, what accounts for the different literature, the different language, all that kind of stuff. But what we're left with then is kind of this really cool picture. So who here has been in my previous classes and remembers the word chiasm? Oh yeah, I've talked about that. So if you're not familiar with that yet, this is a literary device that's used very commonly in the Bible, in the Old Testament, and it's actually pretty cool. It's in the New Testament, some too, but it's a pretty heavy thing, in the Hebrew language. Um, it's and it's a cool thing because it's a literary device that we can actually usually, not always, but usually pick up on in English as well. So here's what a chiasm is. It's, say you have, let's just do it nice and simple. Say you have 4 lines of verse or four lines of anything. A chiasm is organized in such a way that the first line and the last line connect to one another. And then the second and the third line connect to one another. So that's a very simple chiasm. And usually, not always, but usually it points to the center because the center thing is the most important thing. That's kind of the core message of the whole thing. Now, these things can actually get very elaborate. You can have entire chapters in books of the Bible that form chiasms, where the beginning and the end connect to one another. And then the second thing talked about and the second to last thing talked about connect together. And then the third to last, and the fourth, and like they can get very intricate and kind of go on for a long time. They're pretty cool. And the reason why we can often pick up on these in English is because usually it's done by content. Sometimes it's done by language and wording. And that makes it a little harder to pick up on in English because they need to understand the Hebrew to see it. But it's a commonly used and pretty cool device that usually you can find on your own. In Daniel's 2 through 7, those chapters form a pretty cool chiasm. So and I have it written down here, and I kind of have it indented, so hopefully you can see it. So Daniel 2, all right, one of those stories deals with a dream that Nebuchadnezzar has. We're talking about that tonight. But in that dream, he dreams about a statue that represents 4 kingdoms. All right, so the theme is basically 4 kingdoms. Now, if you jump to Daniel 7, Daniel has a vision that needs to be interpreted of 4 beasts. And those 4 beasts represent 4 kingdoms, the same 4 kingdoms that are represented in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. So you can see just the content of chapters 2 and 7 connect to one another. It's the same teaching, it's the same kind of a general idea. Then look at chapters 3 and 6, right? The second chapter and the next to last chapter. We have 2 stories that I'm sure you're familiar with that connect to one another in content. And that is the story of the fiery furnace, faithful ones in jeopardy, right? We have the fiery furnace in chapter 3. In chapter 6 is Daniel and the lion's den. And I'm sure you've probably noticed before that those are kind of almost the same story with different skin on. And thankfully Daniel kept his skin on, right? Anyway, so it's someone being told to worship idols. They refuse to do it, and the king sentences them to death. And then God makes them survive. And then the king says, "Wow, you survived! Your God's amazing!" Right? It's essentially the same story, just a little bit different. So you can see easily how those two connect. And then chapters 4 and 5 connect to one another because both of them are judgments that are brought against the king. Chapter 4 is a judgment against Nebuchadnezzar, and chapter 5 is a judgment against Belshazzar. So um, what was the original arrangement of those tales? I don't know. Were they something that were written down and circulated separately in a different order? I don't know. Okay. But whatever happened, at some point when this book became organized, put together the way that we have it today, it seems likely, perhaps, that it was done by this later author, seems to have very intentionally formed it in such a way that the additions that he brought on connect very intimately with what was already there. And these tales got ordered in such a way to form this chiasm that makes this book a whole unit. And that just brings it together so beautifully. So I don't know about you, but that's the kind of stuff that really gets me excited. Like, I love that. And a line that I have said many times in my classes is one of the cool things about the Bible is not always what it says, but sometimes it's how it says it. I love just finding these beautiful things within the scripture itself and these literary devices and I don't know, I just think it's so cool. And I love you can just see God's hand over it as He brought this thing together in such a beautiful way, not just to say cool things, but also to do it in a cool way. I love it. It's one of my favorite things to look at this week. So all of that to hopefully maybe on one hand answer a few questions. Maybe you were aware of the whole Hebrew Aramaic thing. I don't know. Maybe you've heard that before. Maybe you haven't. Obviously, I'm sure you've been aware of that weird switch between tales to visions and all that kind of stuff. But maybe this helps you understand kind of how it all came together, why it works. but it also helps you understand why I think it's important to look at chapters 2 and chapter 7 together, because this author wanted to bring them together in some way to help unify this book. All right, so without any further ado, let's get to Daniel chapter 2. So we're not going to be in this class looking at most of the tales because a lot of them we're very familiar with, and that's really not the purpose of this class. We really want to look at the apocalyptic nature of this book. And while chapter 2 is not apocalyptic literature, that's important to keep in mind. Like I said, chapters 1 through 6 are tales. And at its core, what chapter 2 is something known as a wisdom story. And it's not apocalyptic literature, it's known as a wisdom story. And I will talk more about that here in a little bit. But first, let's do a quick rundown of Daniel chapter 2, just so we're familiar with the story. So the story goes like this. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon is having troubling dreams. And the king calls all the wise men of the land and issues this decree. He says, if you do not tell me both the dream and the interpretation, this guy's not asking a lot, right? You shall be torn limb from limb, and your houses shall be laid in ruins. But if you do tell me the dream, its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. All right. So the gauntlet has been laid, and boy, it's a doozy. Okay. So the wise men, of course, can't do this, and they start saying things to the king like, "Please, just tell us what the dream is, so we can interpret it. This is unreasonable." Okay. Um, so they can't do it. So the king's like, all right, off with their heads. Now Daniel comes along and he offers to give the king an answer if the king would just give him time, right? Give me a little time. So there's always a big question of like, why was the king so willing to give him time with the other wise, but he's like off with their heads so fast? Well, that's just because that's how the story works, right? So Daniel goes home and he prays to God, and this is a really cool part, just because of this. Not only does he pray for the interpretation, but he gives God all this praise and glory. It's a really cool part of the story. I'll come back to it here in just a little bit. So then Daniel comes before the king and says, no wise men, enchanters, magicians, or diviners can show the king the mystery the king is asking. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. So, and then Daniel proceeds to tell Nebuchadnezzar his dream. So I'm going to go ahead and read this because it's important what the dream was. So he says, you were looking, O king, and lo, there was a great statue. The statue was huge, its brilliance extraordinary. It was standing before you, and its appearance was frightening. The head of that statue was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, uh, its chest and arms of silver, its middle and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. As you looked on, a stone was cut out, not by human hands, and it struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were all broken in pieces and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. So that was the dream. So then Daniel goes on and says this is the interpretation of the dream. So this was the dream. Now we will tell the king its interpretation. You, O king, the king of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, the might, and the glory, into whose hand he has given human beings, wherever they live, the wild animals of the field and the birds of the air, and whom he has established as ruler over them all. You are the head of gold. Yeah, I'd be talking like that too if the guy just threatened to tear it in. I didn't get it right. So anyway, after you shall arise another kingdom inferior to yours, and yet a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over the whole earth. And there shall be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron. Just as iron crushes and smashes everything, it shall crush and shatter all these. As you saw, the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron. It shall be a divided kingdom, but the strength of iron shall be in it. as you saw the iron mixed with the clay, as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly brittle. As you saw the iron mixed with clay, so they will mix with one another in marriage, but they will not. They'll be mixed in marriage, but they will not hold together, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall his kingdom be left to another people. It shall crush all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. Just as you saw that a stone was cut from the mountain, not by hands, and that it crushed the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has informed the king what shall be hereafter. The dream is certain, and its interpretation trustworthy. All right, so that's the interpretation. And then afterwards, the king lavishly rewards Daniel, and again, keeping with the theme of those tales, right? Being faithful in a faithful land, and you will prosper, and you will be blessed, and all this kind of stuff. Not just Daniel and his friends, right? It introduces friends too, that the king honors and lavishes blessings upon them as well. Okay. So the heart of this story has gotten a lot of attention because there's a lot of people trying to identify those four kingdoms. What are those four kingdoms? And so you have differing ideas as far as who those four kingdoms are. We will get to that in just a little bit. But one thing that's important to remember is that, again, I already said it, but this story is a wisdom story. It is not apocalyptic literature. So when we get to the apocalyptic literature, one function of apocalyptic literature is to put into perspective kings and kingdoms and their role and all that kind of stuff. So yes, Jay, go ahead. Yes.
First one, provide any evidence that Daniel was written 165 BC. I haven't seen any evidence. Other than maybe argument from the full.
Mhm.
And the second one is statue was 5 kingdoms. The last one is the feet with iron and clay. And the feet had 10 toes. And that goes back to the 10 kings that will arise when the Antichrist takes power, which hasn't happened. That's my second point.
Okay. Yeah, so the 2 points that he made is he was just wondering about more about the evidence for why Daniel's written in the second century or 165 BC, and that the statue was 5 kingdoms instead of 4. Saying there the difference between the legs of iron and the feet and toe of clay and iron. So did I sum that up correct? Okay, cool. Give me more time. We're going to talk more about the second century thing. So as I go on, I'm definitely going to present more about it. So, oh yes.
He did desecrate the temple.
Mhm.
That could have been the desolation, abomination causing desolation, because Jesus talks about it in Matthew 4 as an event that does not come to pass. So if you're implying that that's when all that happened, it was a precursor, but it's not happened yet.
He was also just bringing up about something that we're going to get to in future weeks. So I'm really not going to address that tonight, just because we are going to get to that. It's going to help. It's not in these chapters at all. The idea of the abomination that desolates, or translated in different ways. Jesus addresses that later. So I promise we'll get to that kind of stuff. We'll have time for good conversation with that. The four kingdom thing. Yes.
Just a reminder, I'm capturing questions. It's
Yeah, just a reminder, Josh is getting all this down. So any question that I don't have the time and cost to really get to, although I think I will over the course of time get to these. We're gonna get down. So for sure. So as far as the king or the statue with the 4 kingdoms, it appears that that fourth kingdom it very clearly talks about one kingdom coming after another. As far as the legs, it says the legs are a kingdom, they're of iron, and then the feet and toes, it mentions toes in the interpretation, but not the initial part. It talks about how it's iron mixed with clay. It never actually does introduce it as a fifth kingdom, and it says that iron will be part of it. So it'll be some kind of entity that has a fourth kingdom part of it, but not the whole of it. It seems to be how that's presented. So yeah, it is a little different than the fourth, but it's still part of the fourth. It seems to be how that's presented. It would be my understanding of that.
Is that answer?
Okay, go ahead.
Is that answer in the New Testament?
Is what answer to the New Testament? Yeah, he asked, is that answer to the New Testament?
The Christians that you're just bringing out.
About the four kingdoms,
Yes.
or
Yes.
not specifically, no. No, I wouldn't be able to point to a part of the New Testament that actually answers as far as how to identify those kingdoms. Is that
Yes.
no, I don't think there's really a part in the New Testament that answers that. So, there's allusions made to it in different ways, but I'm not sure if we can go as far as to say it's trying to be answered. So, it would be my thought on that.
The stone that was cut out by human hands, that crushes all the things. We agree that's Jesus Christ.
I think that's God's kingdom, but I will get to that. I'm getting to all that. So, yeah, hang, you're jumping ahead of me. So you're like 3 miles ahead. I love it. No, that's really, really good. But just let me get there. What's that? That's fine. You just pointing out a difference of opinion here, and that's cool. So I got nothing, no problem with differences of opinions. I'm just sharing as I understand it. We'll have to talk with you anytime about it, but I do need to move on just so I can get through this stuff. But I appreciate you share it. Thank you so much. All right, so where was I with this? Oh yeah, just talking about the point of Daniel 2. So it's not apocalyptic literature. It's talking about how it's a wisdom story, and this is actually a very common type of writing that we see in the ancient Near East, these wisdom stories. There's other ones that can be found in the Bible and in other Jewish literature. But when you come to these wisdom stories, this is basically the general structure that you're going to see. You're going to see some kind of an impossible request, usually made by royalty. So we have that in this story, right? Tell me what my dream is. It's pretty impossible, right? And that then sets up this moment of crisis. The crisis in this one being, if you don't tell me, right? So we have a crisis moment, and there's usually some kind of contest of wits that is set up, right? Who can be the wisest to answer this? It usually involves some kind of unsuccessful counselors. Then we have this outsider who comes in with the wisdom, right? The outsider has the answer. That's Daniel in this story, who has some kind of an ingenious solution that answers or outwits the one making the request. And this is the part right here that's really cool because one of my favorite things to do with especially Old Testament literature is it is a product of its time, right? The Old Testament is written in the ancient Near East, and when we see things like going all the way back to the laws that are written in the Torah or covenant treaties and that kind of stuff, there's always, and in this one, like wisdom stories, there's always some kind of parallel with other literature that you find in the ancient Near East. So some people have found that to be an issue, like thinking that what's written in the Bible needs to be, if it's from God, it has to be unique and one of a kind and all this kind of stuff, which I don't see why that's necessary because, like, in today's day and age, if God wants to speak, I don't have no problem with him using some medium that is popular in our culture. Why not? He can speak through a song, rock and roll, even. Okay. Wouldn't hear rock and roll anymore. So that would be the daring statement like 50 years ago. But you get the idea, right? So I think it's so cool. I think that God uses common types of literature to speak his message. But what's always interesting to find is what's changed, what's different. So in all the other ancient Near East wisdom stories, there's always a person who's wiser than everybody else. And I told you I'd come back to this, but before Daniel goes to the king to tell him the dream and the interpretation, what does he do? He prays and he praises God. Go back and read that this week. It's a really powerful and very important part of Scripture. You may be tempted to jump over that part because you're like, I want to get to the dream, like that part, right? But no, you can't have the interpretation. You can't have Daniel's wisdom without the prayer. So, who's the wise man in this story? Daniel? It's God. God's the wise man in this story, right? Daniel, and I read that. Daniel blatantly says, there's no wise man, there's no person that can answer this, but there's a God who can, right? So Jewish wisdom stories center on God's wisdom. Whereas the rest of the ancient Near East just look for some dude that's wiser than everybody else and thinks a different way. So, what's that? He wasn't. Was he doing that? So, okay. Okay. So, anyway, so God is the wise man in this. All right. So that's just important to remember that that's the point of this story because people get really, really caught up in the kingdoms and how they're presented. But what we're going to see is that the four kingdoms that are being presented is not trying to predict anything, at least not in this story. It's not trying to make some kind of political statement. It's actually using a very, very common understanding of how history unfolded in the ancient Near East. It's very common, and you see it in lots of different cultures spoken of it this way. And I have just a few examples, even though it's all over the place in literature. So there was a guy named Hesiod. He is an 8th century Greek poet. And so he wrote this way back in the 8th century, and he's writing kind of his version of the history of humankind, right? And he sees different races that have appeared since the beginning of time, since Zeus started creating, right? So that's what's but listen to what he does here. So Hesiod's works way back in the 8th century. He says, first of all, the deathless gods who dwell on Olympus made a golden race of mortal men. So he's saying way back in the beginning, when Zeus started creating everybody, the first race of men was a golden race. Okay? But after Earth had covered this generation, so they died off, then they who dwell on Olympus made a second generation, which was of silver and less noble by far. Is it sounding a little familiar yet? So he says, but when earth had covered this generation also, Zeus, the father, made a third generation of mortal men, a brazen race, bronze, right? Sprung from the ash trees, and it was in no way equal to the silver age. So you have a golden race of men, a silver race of men, and a bronze race of men. And then he takes a little digression here and talks about a fourth race, but these are actually the demigods. So this is where he says, people like Hercules and Achilles and Perseus and all the Greek demigod stories, right? Half man, half god, kind of equal. They're the fourth race, but he gives no meta description today. But then he gets to his own race, his own personal time, and he says, therefore, he doesn't like his own race. You're going to pick up on this. He says, thereafter, would that I were not among the men of the fifth generation, but either had died before or been born afterwards. For now truly is a race of iron, right? And men never rest from labor and sorrow and day, perishing, and so on and so forth. So this could actually, and this pops up often in ancient literature, classifying the races of men or empires or epochs or ages. It's put different skin is put on it, but you see this progression of gold, silver, bronze, and iron. So really interesting. So this is not an unusual concept, right? This is a common thing in the ancient areas. It's a way of thinking about history. And then we come to the four kingdom progression. So Daniel 2, Daniel 7, both of them talk about a four kingdom progression. Or in a lot of cases, it's presented as a four kingdom degression because kingdoms sometimes are presented as getting weaker over time, not necessarily in the Daniel story. But here's just a couple examples of this. So here's an excerpt from the writings of Aemilius Sura. He is a Roman historian from the late second to early first century BC. It's about 150 years before Christ, maybe in that time period. And this is just a line from his history. He writes, the Assyrians were the first of all races to hold world power, then the Medes, and after them the Persians, and then the Macedonians. The Macedonians were the Greeks, Macedonian, those words are interchangeable, essentially. So he's presenting this idea of four kingdoms, one after another, Assyrians, Medes, Persians, Greeks, or Macedonians. Then we come to the Sibylline Oracles. This is actually part of the Jewish pseudepigrapha. I talked about this last week. These are extra biblical Jewish writings, of which there's a lot of, and they're really cool to read. Again, they're not scripture, but they're really informative to understand the way these people were thinking about things. So the Sibylline Oracles, this section of it at least, was probably written in the second century, and there's a recounting of the empires throughout history. And in chapter 4 of this book, it says, first the Assyrians will rule over all mortals. It says, then will the Medes destroy and boast on their thrones. It says, third, the Medes will fall under the spears of the Persians. And then he talks about the Macedonians at great length, because that's probably what the time that who was writing this was living. And he says, but when the Macedonians boast of scepters, and he goes on and on about all the crazy things the Macedonians do. So we see that same progression again. Assyrians, Medes, Persians, Macedonians. So for many centuries, this was history's understanding of the progression of empires in the ancient Near East. Assyrians, Medes, Persians, and then the Greeks or the Macedonians. And this was actually kind of the understanding of how history proceeded in the ancient Near East specifically for centuries, really until more like the 18th century, fairly modern times when archaeology became a serious science. And, we began learning later in years that the Medes never really had specific control at any given time. And so if you're presenting a series of empires today, we would understand that we have the Assyrians, then the Babylonians, then the Persians, and then the Greeks. So there's a little bit of a difference in there. So with these ancient societies, the first question you may ask is, where are the Babylonians? Right? So we talk about Babylon in church all the time because Babylon is so prevalent in the Bible. And it's so prevalent in the Bible because, well, these are the people that took the Jewish people into captivity. And Babylon was a serious thing, right? They were in exile in Babylon. So, well, actually, the reason why you don't really see Babylon is not that the ancient Greco-Roman society didn't believe Babylon existed. It's that they actually grouped the Assyrians and the Babylonians together. They believed that the rule of the Babylonian kings was actually the latter part of the Assyrian Empire. So when they're referring to the Assyrians, they're actually being inclusive also of Babylonian kings like Nabopolassar and Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, and these kind of people, right? So they are including them. They just kind of lump them together with the Assyrians. So this is the really interesting part because in modern times, when we're trying to understand the four kingdoms, trying to label them, and trying to understand what was being talked about, the one that's usually the most contentious is the Medes. What to do with the Medes? The Medes are mentioned in Daniel multiple times. I'll share that with you in just a little bit. But especially in chapter 8, he talks about the Medes. We also have King Darius, who's called Darius the Mede, right? So the Medes are mentioned. But we know from history now, looking back, the Medes, although they were a strong people group, they never had an empire like the Assyrians, the Babylonians, or the Persians did. But they were a serious force to be reckoned with. And as a matter of fact, we know going back in history that the Medes actually joined with the Babylonians to help defeat Assyria, right? So they were big players in that. Then when you get to the Persian Empire, sometimes the Medes and the Persians are kind of lumped together, but that really stems from the fact that Cyrus, the first Persian king, but the first one to overtake the Babylon Empire, he was of both Median and Persian descent, right? His mom was a Median, or was it his dad? I can't remember actually. But one of his mom and dad, one was a Mede, one was a Persian, right? So he actually kind of unified the people. Unified is a nice way of saying he beat them up until they submitted him. But he had the ability to be a king of the Medes in a way that no other Persian could because of his lineage, that kind of stuff. So what's interesting is when we look at all the ancient progressions of societies, Babylon's the one that's usually not mentioned, but Media is always there. When we look at modern ones, Christians mostly, looking back at the book of Daniel, trying to identify these nations, usually Media is the one that gets left out. And Babylon's the one that gets added because Babylon's called out by name by Daniel for very good reasons. Okay, so we can even see. So I think flip over to the next page here. We got kind of talked about that. Um, yeah, the bottom line, I mentioned that. Yeah, got ahead of my paper here, so that's cool. But I already said all that. But if you look at the bottom of that next page, you can even see that within the framework of the stories of Daniel, there's an understanding that the progression was for them Babylonians, Medes, then Persians. And you see that cycle repeated 2 times in the book of Daniel. And because you may have noticed this, at the beginning of every tale, just about every tale or story in the book of Daniel, and then the visions. But usually, the chapter usually begins with during the whatever year reign of such and such a king of whoever. They all begin that way, right? So here's the progression that goes through the tales. Right? The first 4 chapters, the first 4 stories were during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, right? Then chapter 5 is under the king of Belshazzar, which is another king of Babylon, following Nebuchadnezzar. Then we have later in chapter 5 and throughout chapter 6 mention of the next king is Darius the Mede. All right, Darius the Mede. We could spend some time talking on him, but he does not appear to actually even exist in history, as far as anyone can tell. But here we have a Median king being shown as the next king. So we have Babylon, Medes, and then finally, at the end of chapter 6, Cyrus, Persian is mentioned. So we see in order of kings, we have Babylonian kings, Median king, and a Persian king. Then we have the visions of Daniel. We have the same progression. Okay. Chapter 7 is Belshazzar, king of Babylon. Chapter 7 and 8, both of the visions happen under Belshazzar. And then chapter 9, the vision of 9, we have Darius, right? The son of Ahasuerus, by descent, a Mede. And the final vision, chapter 10, happens under the reign of Cyrus, king of Persia. So even twice repeated through the book of Daniel, we have that progression, right? We have Babylon, Media, Persia. Okay? Everybody tracking with me? All right, cool. All right, so if we get to this on the next page here, I was trying to just make this as simple as possible. I made this table. All right, so basically on the left side of the table is Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and then on the right side of the table is the interpretation of that part of that. So I was trying to hold things up side by side. So I'm not going to read through this because we already read the whole thing, but this is just for your reference. You can go back and check it out yourself. So just a quick glance, give you guys a chance to respond here. Just a quick glance at this table. Does anything stand out? Anything immediately stand out to you? Maybe just the size of something? Has to do. Okay. It's the fourth kingdom. Its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. Do you see how long the interpretation is next to that one? Right? It's a whole lot longer. So you look down through it. So the first one, it's a little bit long, the interpretation concerning the head of gold. But if you remember, that was mostly flattery. Right? Oh, king, wonderful king that wants to rip my limbs apart. Lovely, beautiful king that all the birds bow down to, right? So there isn't a whole lot of substance there, but it's a little lengthy because in the story, that's the king being addressed. You get a little more. So then this part 2 and part 3 receive almost nothing in the interpretation, right? It just says after you shall, part 2 is after you shall rise another kingdom and in part 3, it says, and yet a third kingdom of bronze which shall rule over the whole earth. So not a whole lot is said there, right? But then you get to that final kingdom, and you got lots, right? And it's not flattery, it's a description. It's description of just how terrible that kingdom is, how strong and how powerful. And we even get this little tidbit about how in that mixed kingdom, they're going to try to hold themselves together through marriage, and even that could fall times, right? So you're going to get these things that are going on here. So it's likely the reason why we have such length there is because that we've now arrived at the reader's time, right? Like they're going to identify with the events that are happening in that moment. So that's why that is so detailed, why that is brought out to such a full extent. So all the way on the left side of that column, I have what I'm submitting to you is the most likely, it seems to me, just by the way the ancient societies understood the progression of kingdoms, the way the progression of kingdoms are presented throughout the book of Daniel itself. This is what we probably see here with these. So we know the head of gold is bad. There's no question about that because Daniel says, it's you. Okay, right? So that is not a question. Everybody begins with Babylon. The questions begin with the second one, right? And the most common two ways of looking at it, well, the one that was looked at for centuries and centuries was understood as media. Because as I just read to you, the ancient understanding of the progression, that four progression of kingdoms, was Assyria, and then was the Babylonians, and media. They always came second, right? So for centuries, it was understood that was the second one. Until more recent years, we began to understand that media never really was an empire the way the other ones were. We began looking back over it and saying, well, it can't be media because there never really was a media in the same sense, although they were a powerful people group in the same sense that everybody else was. So it has to be Medo-Persian, kind of putting those two together. And that's a bit of a more modern, common way of thinking about it. The problem with that is the problem with that is you can kind of see it is it seems to be modern understanding of history being pushed on an ancient piece of literature that doesn't view history the same way, right? We see very clearly that not just the Jewish people, the Greeks, the Romans, the Mesopotamians, they all understood the progression of kingdoms in the same way. It was always presented like that. So that's what we have presented in the book of Daniel. And so the modern attempt seems to be primarily, joining the Medes and the Persians together in an attempt to say, well, this is what the text should say, not what it does say. Where it's important that we let the text speak for itself from its own time. And I think that's really, really important, as opposed to trying to put some kind of truth upon it. See the difference there? So at least that's my take on it. That's my suggestion. The other thing that really doesn't, though, allow it to make sense as being the Medes and the Persians, or the Persian, the Medo-Persian Empire, is the description that's given to it. It says, "After you shall arise another kingdom inferior to yours." Trust me, there was nothing inferior about the Persian kingdom compared to the Babylonians. The Persian kingdom was far more vast, far more powerful, far more influential, and the ancient world understood that. Like there was never a thought that the Babylonians had anything on the Persians, right? It was in no way, shape, or form an inferior kingdom. But the Medes could have been understood as a more inferior kingdom, for sure. All right, so if we have Babylon, Media, then we probably have Persia as the third one. And this description makes a lot of sense, right? And yet a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over the and Persia's kingdom was vast, much larger than the Assyrians and the Babylonians ever had. Huge, huge, huge kingdom. The biggest empire in that part of the world that history had ever seen was the Persians. And then we get to the description of the fourth, or the fourth and fifth, as Jerry's kind of pointing out, which doesn't make sense because the description that we're given is that the fourth kingdom has legs of iron, but then the feet are partly iron and partly clay. So probably what's being presented here is this final kingdom has two stages, right? A stage in which there's iron and it's very strong, and then a stage where it's divided or mixed. And as a matter of fact, and I am going to read this part again for sure. Um, the description or the interpretation even uses the word divided. So it says, and so this is probably talking about the Greek Empire, the Macedonian Empire, because it was far more vast, far stronger, and more terrifying than anything that you could before it. I explained to you last week what Alexander did in 10 years, right? This was scary what Alexander did and how he was able to accomplish it. And then after Alexander died, what happened to the kingdom? It split, right? It split and it became a divided kingdom. And they were always warring amongst themselves. And by the time you get to the second century, the Seleucids especially were very wicked. They had lost that massive battle to Rome. They owed money to Rome. It was a strong but brittle country, nation. And so this is the description offered by Daniel. He says, and there shall be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, just as iron crushes and smashes everything. It shall crush and shatter all these. As you saw, so that sounds very much like what Alex. He said, and as you saw, the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay, partly of iron. It shall be a divided kingdom. After Alexander's death, the kingdom was divided. But some of the strength of iron shall be in it. So there's still Greek. The iron's still in it, but it's divided. It says, as you saw, the iron mixed with the clay, as the toes of feet were part iron and part clay. So the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly brittle. As you saw, the iron mixed with clay. So they will mix with one another in marriage. But they will not fit together, just as iron does not mix with clay. Go ahead and flip to the next page here, which I kind of already been speaking on a lot. But specifically, note that little detail like that's thrown in there. It's getting a little more specific. It's describing how terrifying this fourth kingdom is, and it's getting a little more specific about how it stomps everything out and it's going to be partly strong and partly brittle. But then all of a sudden, there's this, and they'll be unified in marriage, but it won't hold together. Like it's awfully specific detail to throw in there, right? As a matter of fact, what's probably being talked about here, and it's almost definite because we come back to Daniel chapter 11, it's very specifically talked about there, is that the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, these are the ones to the north and to the south of Jerusalem, that were constantly warring with one another. There was a few occasions in which they attempted peace, and usually what happens when you attempt peace is the king does what? Sends the daughter off to get married, orphans, right? You go marry my enemy, right? And then maybe we'll have peace between us. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. It happened twice, two times very predominantly between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. So around 250 BC, this is towards the bottom of that next page. It says around 250 BC, the daughter of Ptolemy II, Bernice, was wed to Antiochus II to seal a peace treaty. But Laodice, Antiochus II's first wife, murdered Bernice and her infant son. This is why you stick to one woman. And good. Marry but one. Um, so that didn't end well. So then, about 50 years later, in 199 BC, Antiochus III now gave his daughter Cleopatra to Ptolemy V as his wife. So we're sending a daughter in the opposite direction now. But Cleopatra's loyalties never shifted, and this resulted in absolute and didn't hold together. So there were a few times, those two very notably, where marriage was attempted between the two parts of the divided kingdom and it didn't hold together. So, all these details really begin to line up in a pretty big way that make it pretty obvious. And it just really seems to be that way. So then we get to the final part, um, and it's described as the stone cut from human hands. And this is going to be obviously representative of God's eternal kingdom. All right, so Daniel describes this kingdom as crushing all these kingdoms, standing forever and filling the whole earth. And this very deeply mirrors the language of Jewish eschatological hopes. Eschatological just meaning like end of time hopes, or day of the Lord is a very common Old Testament phrase that's used, looking forward to this time where God will intervene, right? And it was said in the interpretation that in the days of those kings, kind of referring to that final king, when God's going to make this. So all of this at the end comes up to a promise, right? That as great as these empires seem, when we get to that fourth kingdom, the most terrifying of all of them, sure we can lavish some compliments on Nebuchadnezzar, but when it comes to the fourth kingdom, that's the scary one, right? That's the one that trims out everything, crushes and destroys and devours, right? That language is very intense there. But God comes in and takes something that's unnatural. Notice everything before, all those metals were what? They're man-made, right? It's very intentionally done that way. Daniel's using this in an important way. These kingdoms, they're human kingdoms. Gold, silver, bronze, iron, they're all precious metals. They're strong. Some are stronger than others, but they're all man-made, right? These are things that men use to craft jewelry and do all these very specific things with. But no man ever made a stone, right? And no, and so God cuts this stone out, not by human hands, and smashes everything, right? It all comes down to pieces. And so this is the second break that we see, no pun intended. This is the second break from traditional wisdom story that we see happening here in the book of Daniel. Because normally in these wisdom stories, right, you have a king making some kind of impossible demand, do this or I kill you. And the wise person comes in, does something ingenious, and the king has to admit, yes, you're wise, you outwitted me, or whatever. And usually, but by the end, it's somehow glorifying that king in some way. You gotta understand, we're not used to this because we're so used to reading the Bible. As for modern Christians, typically the Bible is the only ancient literature we ever really read. And the Bible's usually not very nice to kings. Have you noticed this? The Bible usually has, even if it's Israel's kings, right? Israel and Judah's kings, it's usually not very nice to them. Why? Because who's king? God's king, right? And that's the message of the prophets. God is king, right? You need to submit to him. So if a king submits to God, well, we'll say nice things about you. If you don't submit to God, we'll not say nice things about you. That doesn't exist anywhere else in the ancient world. Anywhere else in the ancient world, all literature makes the king happy. It's all about promoting the king. Why? Well, because of what happens if you don't say nice things about the king. You get torn limb from limb. So although in this story of the statue, the destruction comes, many nations or empires removed from Nebuchadnezzar, ultimately the story is when God is stronger and more powerful than you, because it doesn't say that God just destroys the final kingdom. God destroys all kingdoms, right? From top to bottom. The stone hits the bottom, but it destroys the entire thing. The head, just like the rest of it, is broken into pieces. So, if this was following the normal ancient literature trope of how these wisdom stories go, the king would not be happy with this story and with this interpretation. But Nebuchadnezzar is beautifully happy with this, right? Oh, Daniel, this is incredible, and I'm going to lavish all of these things on you. Why? Because this is not apocalyptic literature, because it's not anything other than Jewish wisdom story. And in the end, Daniel, really God, was shown to be wise, okay? He was shown to be wise and was brought honor because of it. And so that's what we have in the end here. So it's a really interesting story because that whole the four nations thing and God being more powerful, his kingdom being the strongest of all, is thrown in there at the end as another little kind of twist on the normal story. But then in the end, it's a wisdom story because Daniel is praised for his wisdom. So then the last thing to really discuss though with this is more specifically what is this stone that's cut from the mountain? And the interpretations differ a little bit. Is this stone specifically representing Jesus Christ, or is it just a more general way to speak of God's kingdom as a whole? So there's really nothing in the rest of the Bible or the New Testament that forces us to try to see this stone as Jesus himself. Um, and I mean, Jesus obviously was the thing that kind of brought God's kingdom. Like, absolutely. There's no question about that. But I don't see any way that the ancient readers would have understood or taken it in this way. And ultimately, it doesn't really matter. It's more of a moot point, really, because the message is the same in that God will establish an eternal kingdom because, well, he's God, right? And this kingdom can't be destroyed, unlike kingdoms that came before him. So it was just probably to be understood. But anyway, so this final kingdom that comes in really just identifies very closely with all the Old Testament eschatological hopes that we see. I mean, you read through the Old Testament prophets and over, like, read through some of the latter parts of the book of Isaiah, and you just hear this beautiful language about how God will bring his people together and establish a kingdom forever, and how the people of God will be the rulers of the world, will be on the highest hill of all the planet, and everybody's going to come to them, and their influence will spread out. They'll bring life to the rest of the world. And Ezekiel draws these beautiful pictures of the river of life flowing out from all of this. And so there's this language is all over the Old Testament. So there's for centuries been this looking forward to a time where God will do this incredible thing. And that message hasn't changed, right? So it's very much so in line with that. And the Jewish eschatological hopes moving forward. Okay. So that brings us to the end of chapter 2, and I have 6 minutes to do chapter 7. Yeah, I thought this would happen. So, all right, here's what we're going to do. I have to bring it to an end here, because, I mean, unless anybody else wants to stay for another, but I'm not sure my voice can do this, actually. So here's what we're going to do. So for next week, spend some time in Daniel 7. I definitely want to get into that and hopefully get into 8. I got to keep this thing moving, right? So that's my desire. But now that you're hopefully a little more intimately aware of what's happening in chapter 2, remember that chapter 7 is very much so connected to chapter 2. So basically, we're going to see that same 4 kingdoms presented just like they were in chapter 2. It's just that in Daniel's dream, they're a little different. They're not a statue anymore. They're 4 different beasts, right? You have 4 different beasts that come up out of the sea, and each of these beasts represents different kingdoms. A couple things to notice. Notice, and you'll see this even more so in chapter 7 than we even saw it here in chapter 2, is that when you get to that 4th kingdom, a whole lot of time is spent there, right? A whole lot of time. There's a lot more detail, and it's very important what happens right there in the 4th beast. So look for those similarities. Excuse me. Look for those similarities between chapter 2 and chapter 7. You can see how it kind of unifies those 2 chapters and forms the brackets of that chiasm that I was explaining earlier on, that beautiful literary device is used to unify this book. And but also pick up on the differences. Pick up on the difference of themes through it, the difference of the way things are presented. Here in remember chapter 2, I brought these up already. Look for this. In chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar, not too much bad was said about him, right? I mean, generally, it was Daniel kind of like being really nice to him and hoping to prosper in the kingdom, because that's what happens. If you're faithful in this unfaithful land, God will prosper you. And by the end, Nebuchadnezzar recognizes the wisdom of Daniel, by default recognizing the wisdom of God and acknowledging that and rewarding him for that. So Nebuchadnezzar is presented as a very redeemable king in that story, as he is throughout the first half of the book of Daniel. Notice you'll see none of that in chapter 7. There's nothing redeemable about any of the kings. They just need to be destroyed. Even from the imagery of the beasts coming out of the sea, we'll get into more of all of that. So you're going to see a difference in tone in that regard. Also, you're going to see, notice like the ending is a little bit different. So remember, the whole thing of Daniel 2, I've said this over and over again, was to prove Daniel to be wise, or God to be wise, and to be rewarded because of that. So that's the goal of chapter 2, if you will, right? It doesn't necessarily, the goal is not to teach the progression of kingdoms. It just kind of uses the progression of kingdoms within its story, within the framework of the story. And it uses a very commonly understood ancient way of thinking about the progression of these kingdoms. But when you get to chapter 7, the whole thing is about those kingdoms, right? And the fate of those kingdoms. It's not just using that to get a point across. That is the point, right? The fate of those kingdoms. And it all ends in Judgment Day, the Ancient of Days, pronouncing judgment and all that kind of stuff. So, all right. So there's your little bit of homework for next week. Yeah, I need to close this out because it's time. But I'll see you next week for chapter 7 and hopefully some of chapter 8. We'll see what happens. Hopefully it doesn't go. But let's close in prayer. Lord, I thank you so much again for your amazing word. and for this opportunity to study it, to devour it. As I talked about last week, God, and I just say it again, I just pray that help every single one of us in this room, myself included, to humbly approach your word, to just come at you with open arms and to try our best to understand, and to let that understanding evolve and grow into what you have for us, Lord God. And I just pray that at no point will any of us stop seeking you or seeking your truth, wherever that may lead us. We thank you so much for this opportunity to study your word, even the challenging parts of it that spark wonderful conversation and debate that just grows and strengthens us sharply. So I thank you for this so much. I pray for everyone as we head out tonight that your hand of protection will be upon us. In your name we pray. Amen. Amen. All right. Well, I love you all. Thank you for being here tonight. See you next week on the weekend.